There are things a civilian population tells itself during wartime that become, over time, something close to belief. In the spring of 1945, in the towns and villages of central Germany, tens of thousands of ordinary German men and women had constructed a version of reality they had lived inside for years. They had seen the trains arrive at certain facilities. They had smelled what the wind carried from certain directions on certain days. They had noticed the prisoners in striped uniforms working the fields and roadsides under armed guard. They had heard, in the way that people in small communities always hear things, fragments of information that their minds had chosen not to assemble into a complete picture. And they had told themselves, with the practiced conviction of people who understood instinctively that knowing carried consequences that they did not know. This was the rule that governed their survival. Ignorance as shield. Innocence claimed loudly enough and long enough becomes, for the person claiming it, something indistinguishable from the truth. In the town of Weimar, one of the great cultural centers of German civilization, the city of Goethe and Schiller, a city of concert halls and universities and theaters, the citizens had been living 4 miles from one of the largest concentration camps in Germany for 8 years. 4 miles, the distance a person walks in an hour. And they had told themselves, and each other, and anyone who asked, that they did not know what was happening up on that hill. In April 1945, one man decided that rule no longer applied. His name was George Smith Patton, Jr. He was 59 years old. He was the commanding general of the United States Third Army. He had fought from North Africa, through Sicily, through France, through Belgium, into the heart of Germany. He had seen, across 3 years of combat, virtually every form of death and destruction that modern warfare could produce. Nothing had prepared him for what he was about to see. And when the German civilians of Weimar told him they did not know what was happening 4 miles from their city, his response would become one of the most documented and morally charged moments of the entire war. To understand what George Patton did in April 1945, you need to understand where George Patton was, not geographically, psychologically. The war in Europe was effectively over. Everyone with access to a map and an honest assessment of the military situation understood this. Germany was being compressed from both sides, the Red Army advancing from the east, the Allied armies from the west, into an ever-shrinking perimeter around a regime that had lost every strategic asset it had once possessed. The Rhine had been crossed. The industrial heartland of the Ruhr had been encircled. Berlin itself was under direct threat. For Patton, this should have been the moment of supreme professional satisfaction. His Third Army had advanced further and faster than any American formation in the history of the war. From the breakout at Avranches in August 1944, through the relief of Bastogne in December, through the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, his army had covered ground at a pace that German commanders described in their post-war memoirs with something close to disbelief. In 11 months of combat operations, the Third Army had liberated or captured more than 81,000 square miles of territory. It had taken more than 1,250,000 prisoners. It had inflicted losses on the German military that entire army groups had failed to achieve in years of fighting. And yet Patton, in the spring of 1945, was not satisfied. He was furious. He was furious because he believed, with the specific conviction of a man who is almost certainly right, that the war was being allowed to end too slowly. He had been stopped at the Czech border by orders from above, when, in his judgment, his army could have driven to Prague. He was being constrained by political considerations he did not fully understand and did not wish to understand. He was watching what he considered a strategic opportunity, the complete destruction of the German military capacity, being managed rather than finished. He wrote in his diary during this period with the frustration of a man who cannot stop the clock. The entries are specific, impatient, and occasionally savage in their assessment of the decisions being made above him. In one entry, he describes the halt orders with language that his editors sanitized in post-war publication. The unexpurgated diaries, available in the Library of Congress, capture a man operating under the specific strain of a professional soldier who can see the finish line and has been ordered to slow down 50 yards short of it. George Patton, in April 1945, was a man operating at the absolute peak of his military capabilities and constrained from using them fully. He was wound tight. He was looking for something to do. He did not have to wait long. To understand what Patton found on April 12, 1945, you need to understand what Ohrdruf was and what it represented in the larger architecture of what Germany had built. Ohrdruf was a sub-camp of the Buchenwald concentration camp complex, established in late 1944 to provide forced labor for the construction of a planned underground telecommunications center for the German military. It was not one of the major camps. It did not operate for years. By the standards of what the Nazi concentration camp system had become by 1945, it was a relatively small facility. None of that changes what it was. The prisoners who were forced to build it, Jewish men transported from other camps, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, worked under conditions that the documentation of the camp describes with the clinical precision of SS administrative records that American forces captured intact. Food rations calibrated to extract maximum labor while accelerating physical deterioration. Housing that provided no protection against the central German winter. A medical system whose purpose was to determine when a prisoner was no longer useful, rather than to preserve their health. When the military situation in early 1945 made the camp's operation impractical, the SS guards who ran it did what SS guards across the camp system were doing in the same period. They killed those prisoners who could not be marched and force-marched the rest westward, away from the advancing American lines. On April 4, 1945, soldiers of the 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, entered the town of Ohrdruf in the German state of Thuringia. They found the camp before they fully understood what they were looking at. The soldiers who entered Ohrdruf on April 4th were combat veterans. The 4th Armored Division had fought from Normandy through France, through the Battle of the Bulge. These were not men who were easily shocked. They had seen combat death in every form that the Western Front produced. What they found at Ohrdruf was not combat death. It was something that had no precedent in their experience. Bodies left where prisoners had fallen or been executed in the final days before the German guards fled. Gallows, evidence of systematic operation, organized with an administrative thoroughness that the soldiers standing in front of it had no immediate framework to process. The smell, which survivors and liberators of every concentration camp describe in their accounts with the specific language of something that language is not quite adequate to capture. The soldiers of the 4th Armored Division documented what they found with the urgency of men who understood instinctively that what they were looking at needed to be recorded. They sent word up the chain of command. Word reached Patton. 8 days later, on April 12, 1945, General George S. Patton arrived at Ohrdruf. He did not come alone. With him were General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, and General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, three of the most senior American military commanders in the European theater, traveling together to a former concentration camp, subcamp, in central Germany. Patton had insisted. His insistence is documented in the accounts of officers around him and in Eisenhower's own diary from this period. Patton's position, stated with the directness that characterized everything he communicated, was that Eisenhower needed to see this personally, not receive a briefing about it, not review photographs of it. Come and see it with his own eyes. Eisenhower came. Patton has seen everything. That is what his record says about George Patton by April 12, 1945. 40 years of military service, combat in Mexico, combat in France in the First World War, North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the hedgerows of France, the frozen roads of Belgium, in the worst winter in decades. He has seen men burned alive in tanks. He has seen what artillery does to human bodies at close range. He has walked through towns that no longer exist as structures, only as rubble fields. He walks into Ohrdruf, and he is not prepared. The accounts of his visit have been preserved in military records, in the diaries and memoirs of officers present, and in Patton's own writings. He walks through the camp with Eisenhower and Bradley. He sees the bodies of prisoners executed before the Germans fled. He sees the evidence of what this facility was and what it did. The infrastructure of systematic killing, organized with the administrative efficiency of a functioning bureaucracy, now frozen in place, abandoned mid-operation, available for inspection by the men who had ended the regime that built it. Multiple witnesses document what happens. Patton steps away from the group. He finds a corner of the compound, away from the assembled officers and correspondents. He is physically sick. This is not a small detail. George Patton had built his entire public identity, and much of his private one, around physical and psychological toughness. He was the general who had slapped hospitalized soldiers for what he called cowardice. He was the general who drove himself and his men harder than any other American commander in the theater. He was the general who was famous, across 2 armies and 3 years of combat, for his absolute refusal to show weakness in front of his men. At Ohrdruf, in a corner of a liberated concentration camp, George Patton, the man who told his soldiers that the object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other poor dumb bastard die for his, steps away from the group and vomits. He collects himself. He rejoins Eisenhower and Bradley. They continue moving through the camp. Eisenhower does not look away. Bradley does not look away. These 3 men, who have between them managed the largest American military operation in history, stand in Ohrdruf and look at what they have liberated and what they feel is documented in their own words in the hours and days that follow. Eisenhower writes to his superior, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, the same day. His letter is one of the most significant documents in the American military record of the Second World War. He describes what he has seen at Ohrdruf with the clinical precision of a man who wants the record to be absolutely clear. He writes that he made the visit deliberately so that he could personally attest to what he witnessed, if asked. He notes that he has seen many things in this war that he wishes he had not seen. He states that he wanted to be able to refute, with the authority of his own presence, any future claim that the reports from these camps were exaggerated. He is already thinking about the denial that has not yet come. He is building the evidentiary record against it before the war is even over. Bradley describes the visit in his post-war memoir with a restraint that does not fully conceal what it cost him. He writes that he was unable to speak for a time after leaving the camp. Omar Bradley, a man who had commanded the largest American field army in the history of the country, who had managed the Normandy landings and the drive across France and the response to the German offensive in the Ardennes, was unable to speak. Patton also writes, his diary entry from April 12th is one of the most quoted passages in the extensive literature surrounding his life and career. He describes Ohrdruf in terms that mix military specificity with something rawer. He uses language in his diary that he does not use in official communications. He describes what he felt with a directness that his public persona rarely permitted. He also describes what he does next. He makes calls. He is on the telephone to his corps commanders, to his staff, to the officers responsible for the areas his army is moving through. The war is still in progress. His army is still advancing. He is still commanding the largest American military formation in the theater, and in the middle of that, he is making calls about what needs to happen to the German civilian population of the towns and cities his army is liberating. They need to see. On April 11th, 1945, one day before Patton's visit to Ohrdruf, the Buchenwald concentration camp had been liberated by the 6th Armored Division, also part of Patton's Third Army. Buchenwald sat on a wooded hillside on the Ettersberg, 4 miles north of Weimar. The camp had been established in July 1937. It had been in continuous operation for 8 years. By April 1945, it held more than 21,000 surviving prisoners. The name Buchenwald means beech forest. The hill was wooded. Goethe had walked those same woods a century earlier, in his evening strolls from Weimar. The beech trees he had moved among now stood at the perimeter of a facility whose purpose was the systematic destruction of human beings. This is not a literary embellishment. It is geography. The contrast between what Weimar represented in German cultural history and what had been built 4 miles from its center was something that the officers and journalists who wrote about the liberation returned to repeatedly because it was impossible to avoid. Weimar, the city of Goethe and Schiller, the city that gave the Weimar Republic its name. Concert halls, the Bauhaus School, university buildings, the accumulated cultural achievement of 2 centuries of German intellectual and artistic life. 4 miles away, 8 years of operation, more than 56,000 documented deaths. And the citizens of Weimar had told anyone who asked that they did not know what was happening up on that hill. On April 16, 1945, Patton orders the citizens of Weimar to the camp. The organization of this civilian procession is carried out by American soldiers who have spent the preceding days moving through Buchenwald themselves. These are not men approaching the task with detachment. They are men who have been altered in the specific permanent way that certain experiences alter people, by what they saw. They are carrying out an order they believe, with complete conviction, is right. 1,200 German civilians are assembled. The number is documented in American military records from the period. 1,200 men and women from Weimar. The column moves. Think about what this march means from the perspective of the people walking it. These are not SS guards. These are not camp administrators. These are not the men who built and ran the system. These are ordinary people, by and large. Shopkeepers, professors from the university, factory workers, housewives who attended concerts in the city that Goethe called home, retired civil servants, people who had made the calculations that ordinary people make under totalitarian governments about what to see, what to say, and what to allow themselves to understand. They had built their version of not knowing carefully over years, because not knowing was the strategy that allowed them to continue their lives. It was the story they had told their children. It was the story they had told each other. It had become, over 8 years of telling, something they had largely come to believe. Now, they are walking 4 miles toward the thing they do not know. The road from Weimar climbs toward the Ettersberg. It moves through the beech forest. The trees are beginning to show the first growth of April. The column of 1,200 people moves through them toward the gates of Buchenwald. The gates, the compound, the watchtowers, the barracks, long wooden structures that held far more people than they were built to contain. The evidence of 8 years of systematic operation, visible in every detail of the camp's organization. The crematoria, the documented medical experimentation facilities, the records, meticulous, bureaucratic, organized with the specific thoroughness of an administration that believed its work was permanent, that American investigators would spend months working through after liberation. The prisoners who were still in the camp when American soldiers arrived on April 11th. Men who weighed what men weigh when they have been systematically starved. Men who could not stand without support. Men who had survived 8 years of Buchenwald and who were now watching from inside the wire as the civilian column from the city, 4 miles away, moved through the place that had been built in their proximity. The documented accounts of the civilian march describe reactions across the full spectrum of human response to an unbearable situation. Some of the civilians weep, genuinely and visibly, whether from guilt, from shock, from grief at what they are seeing, or from the specific horror of confronting the gap between what they told themselves and what actually existed in front of them. The weeping is documented in contemporaneous reporting from journalists present at the march. Some faint. American personnel are on hand, and the records of the day note the treatment of civilians who collapse during the procession. Some try not to look. They find that the soldiers escorting them are not inclined to allow this. The documentation of specific exchanges between American soldiers and German civilians who attempted to avert their eyes is part of the record. There are children in the column. German children walking through Buchenwald in April 1945 alongside their parents, seeing what their country had built 4 miles from their homes, in the woods their grandparents had walked in. What those children understood of what they were seeing, and what they carried from that day into the rest of their lives, is something that only they could answer. But they were there. The documentation is clear. The mayor of Weimar is among those who walk through the camp. His name was Dr. Martin Schmidt. He walks through Buchenwald on April 16, 1945, as part of the civilian procession ordered by Patton's command. He sees what there is to see. He returns to Weimar. That night, Dr. Schmidt and his wife take their own lives. The documentation of this is part of the historical record. The civil administrator of one of Germany's great cultural cities walked through Buchenwald on a Thursday afternoon and did not survive the week. What that decision meant, whether it was guilt, whether it was shame, whether it was the specific despair of a man who could no longer maintain the distance between what he had permitted himself to know and what he had just been forced to see with his own eyes, is something only he knew when he made it. But he had walked through the camp. The claim of not knowing was no longer available to him. Patton is informed of the mayor's death. His documented response is not sympathy. He has just walked through Ohrdruf. He has just ordered 1,200 people through Buchenwald. He has a precise understanding of the moral calculus involved, and his assessment of where the weight falls is not complicated. He continues making calls. He is not finished. His communications in this period, to military colleagues, to journalists covering the Third Army, to officers in his command structure, return repeatedly to the same point. The German civilian population cannot be permitted to maintain the fiction of ignorance. The post-war world that is already visibly taking shape requires, as its foundation, an honest reckoning with what Germany did. That reckoning cannot begin if the people who lived alongside it for 12 years are allowed to start the post-war period with their chosen story intact. He is not a political philosopher. He is not a war crimes prosecutor. He is a general who has just seen Ohrdruf and who is acting with the authority and directness that define everything he does on what he believes. You cannot build a just peace on a foundation of lies. The lies have to go first. This is where the story pauses for a moment. Everything in this video is documented. Real names, real dates, real words spoken by real people in extraordinary moments. That documentation exists, but without someone telling the story, it dies in an archive. Your subscription keeps that from happening. Hit that like button and subscribe. There are hundreds more stories exactly like this one sitting in the same archives. We find them. That is all we do. Back to April 1945. Among the prisoners liberated at Buchenwald was a 16-year-old boy named Elie Wiesel. He had been transferred to Buchenwald from Auschwitz in January 1945, during the death marches west as the Soviet army advanced from the east. He had survived Auschwitz. He had survived the death march. He had survived Buchenwald to the moment of American arrival. He was 16 years old, standing inside Buchenwald when the soldiers of the 6th Armored Division came through the gates. In the decades that followed, Wiesel became the most widely read witness to the Holocaust in any language. His memoir, published in French in 1958 and translated into dozens of languages in the years that followed, described what he had experienced, including the final days at Buchenwald, with a specificity and moral clarity that made it impossible to look away. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986. In his acceptance speech, he spoke about the obligation of witness, the obligation of those who saw to tell what they saw, so that those who were not there could not claim not to know. He was using the same logic Patton had acted on 40 years earlier, not from philosophy, from the experience of having been on the other side of it. Wiesel died in 2016. He was 87 years old. What Patton did in April 1945, at Ohrdruf and in ordering the Weimar civilian march through Buchenwald, was not a policy directive that came from above. It was not a calculated strategic decision with documented planning behind it. It was the response of one man to what he saw, applied with the authority he held and the conviction that what he was doing was correct. But its effects extended far beyond a single week in April. Eisenhower's visit to Ohrdruf, which Patton's presence and insistence helped catalyze, directly shaped the Supreme Commander's response to the final weeks of the war and to the post-war occupation of Germany that followed. Immediately after visiting Ohrdruf, Eisenhower directed American units throughout the theater to send delegations through the liberated camps wherever operationally possible. He reached out to American and British journalists attached to the Allied forces, encouraging and in some cases arranging visits to the camps for people whose professional role was to tell the public what they had witnessed. He also sent a specific request to Washington. He asked that members of the United States Congress be brought to Europe to see the camps personally. The request was acted on. A bipartisan congressional delegation visited Buchenwald and other liberated camps in late April and early May 1945. Their published report, issued in May 1945, placed on the official American political record a first-hand documented account of what the camps were, written by elected officials who had seen them with their own eyes. Eisenhower's stated reason for all of this, documented in his communications from the period, is specific and deliberate. He anticipated, with the clarity of a man already thinking in terms of decades rather than weeks, that there would come a time when people would claim that what happened in these places did not happen. He wanted witnesses, as many witnesses as possible, from as many different backgrounds and positions of authority as possible, so that the record would be so full and so varied that denial could not gain serious traction. He was right about the denial coming. It came. Organizations dedicated to minimizing or erasing the historical record of the camps operated in Germany and elsewhere in the post-war decades. They found audiences. They published. They worked to establish in public consciousness a version of events that the documentation Eisenhower insisted on creating made impossible to sustain among anyone willing to look at the evidence. The denazification policy that American forces implemented in the occupation zone bore the direct mark of what senior American commanders had seen in April 1945. The requirement that German adults complete detailed questionnaires about their wartime affiliations and activities. The removal of former Nazi Party members from positions of authority in government, education, and the judiciary. The establishment of tribunals to assess individual complicity. These policies were imperfect in their execution. The pressures of the Cold War and the practical necessities of rebuilding a functional German state worked against their fullest application. But their underlying logic was the same logic that Patton had acted on in ordering the Weimar March. Ignorance claimed after the fact is not the same as ignorance that actually existed, and the post-war order had to be built on that distinction. The Nuremberg trials, which opened in November 1945, were the formal legal expression of an Allied decision that had been building since the first camps were liberated. The decision that there would be accountability, that claiming ignorance, the same claim that the citizens of Weimar had made before Patton marched them through Buchenwald, would not be accepted as a defense for those whose decisions had built and maintained the system. 12 senior figures of the Nazi regime were sentenced to death at Nuremberg. 7 received prison sentences. 3 were acquitted. The trials established, as a matter of international legal record, the documented operational history of what the regime had done, the decisions, the orders, the administrative structures, the specific individuals responsible for specific actions. That record exists. It exists because of the documentation that American forces, acting on the instincts of commanders like Patton and the deliberate policy of commanders like Eisenhower, insisted on creating in the spring of 1945, when the camps were fresh and the witnesses were alive and the evidence was in front of them. George Patton did not survive to see the post-war world he helped create take its final shape. In November 1945, 7 months after Ohrdruf and the Weimar March, he was injured in a vehicle accident in occupied Germany. A collision between his staff car and a military truck on a road near Mannheim on December 9th left him with a severe spinal cord injury. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He was conscious and aware of his condition. He died on December 21st, 1945. He was 59 years old. He had survived the First World War. He had survived North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and the drive into the heart of Germany. He had led the most successful American field army of the war across 11 months of continuous combat operations. He died in a peacetime vehicle accident 12 days after the war he had devoted his life to was over. He is buried by his own request with the soldiers of the Third Army at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg. He asked to be placed among his men. The documentation of this request and its fulfillment is part of the historical record. His grave is marked the same way as every other grave in that cemetery. No special monument, no elevated position. He is buried among the men who served under him, which is what he asked for and what he believed was right. The city of Weimar still exists. It remains one of Germany's great cultural cities. The Goethe and Schiller Archive is there. The Bauhaus University is there. The theaters and museums and university buildings that existed in April 1945 have been rebuilt or restored. The city that 1,200 of whose citizens walked through Buchenwald on Patton's order has lived in the decades since, with the specific complexity of a place that carries that history whether it chooses to or not. The Buchenwald Memorial Site on the Ettersberg Hill receives hundreds of thousands of visitors per year. The road between Weimar and Buchenwald, the road that the civilian column walked in April 1945, still exists. People drive it every day. The German civilians who made that walk in April 1945 returned to their city. They rebuilt their lives in the post-war years inside the structures of the denazification process and the new West German state. What they made of what they had seen, how they talked about it, or chose not to talk about it in the decades that followed, what they told their children, what they told themselves, these are questions that the historical record answers only partially, through the testimonies of those who chose to speak and the silence of those who did not. The 1,200 people who walked to Buchenwald in April 1945 are almost certainly all dead now. The youngest among them would be in their 90s. What they saw that day and what they did with it traveled with them through the rest of their lives and is now largely beyond recovery. What is not beyond recovery is the record of what happened, the military documentation, the journalistic accounts, the photographs, the testimony of the prisoners who watched the civilian column from inside the wire, the records of the camp itself, captured intact by American forces, available in archives on 2 continents. Patton understood something on April 12, 1945, standing in Ohrdruf with Eisenhower and Bradley, that he acted on before he had time to reason through all its implications. He understood that the claim of not knowing was both false and dangerous. False because proximity and time make complete ignorance implausible. Dangerous because if that claim were allowed to stand, if the civilian population of the surrounding towns were permitted to maintain their practiced innocence as the foundation of the post-war order, then everything that came after would be built on a lie. He forced a confrontation. It was crude in its execution. It was not universally applied. It solved nothing by itself, but it was correct in its underlying logic. And the world that emerged from 1945, imperfect, incomplete in its accountability, complicated in every way that real history is complicated, was built on a foundation that included, in one documented afternoon in April, an American general who looked at the citizens of one of Germany's great cultural cities and said, "No, you claimed not to know. Now you know." This story is proof that the most important history is often the least famous. If that proof convinced you this channel is worth following, subscribe. Every video we make is proof that the archives have more than the textbooks. Subscribe so we can keep proving it. Where are you watching from? Drop your country below. Proof that people everywhere care about stories like this. That is what your comment adds to. Thank you for being proof that this story still matters. History needs witnesses. You were one today.